afternoon, everybody. So happy to be here and very proud to introduce Nompumelelo and Lethabo. They are fourth-year occupational therapy students. In a few months, they will be my colleagues, but I am their supervisor for this project. They have worked very hard over the past 2.5 years on this research project, and I'm going to pass on to them to share their research findings with you.
And good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to be presenting our research with the title Non-First Language English-Speaking Student Experiences at Wits University. Okay, Ms. Erica has already introduced us. So essentially, as we all know, South African universities are a melting pot of languages where most of the students are non-first language English speaking, navigating the complex transition from high school to a rigorous academic baseline, which is varsity, right? This study addresses a critical challenge in this environment, which is how does language barriers actually impact the academic success of these students? And then the study also, focuses mainly on non-first language English speaking students in occupational therapy at Wits University. So why is this? So the study is vital for enhancing educational equity. Non-first language English speakers often struggle with the dense terminology of occupational therapy, as well as the concepts, which can hinder their success and their participation in class, their clarity in assignments, as well as their effectiveness in clinical settings. So by exploring these hurdles and identifying the gaps in the already existing support structures that Wits has, this research aims to provide crucial insights. So the ultimate goal is to offer practical recommendations that empower these students not only to succeed, but also to excel in their chosen career fields. And then our central aim is to thoroughly explore the experiences of non-first language English-speaking students as they engage with the occupational therapy curriculum at Wits. And then to achieve this, we have 3 key objectives, which are to explore the specific challenges that these students face, to identify the strategies that they currently use to cope, and also to determine what support is required to help them overcome their challenges and to thrive. And then these are just some of the terms that we use throughout our research. And then for the background of the research, so we are now 30 years post-apartheid, yet education in South Africa is still shaped by its legacy. Apartheid policies like the Bantu Education Act of 1953, as well as the Afrikaans Decree of 1974, created segregation and entrenched English and Afrikaans as dominant languages in higher education. Although post-apartheid policies such as the 2002 National Act for Higher Education promote multilingualism, English still remains the main language of learning and teaching. This contributes to the disadvantage of non-first language English-speaking students who must not only learn in their English or in a language that is not their mother tongue, but they also need to master complex academic content in it. So this study contributes to existing literature by Ramafigeng by confirming that the dominance of English in South African universities continues to disadvantage non-first language English-speaking students, affecting their confidence, their participation in class, as well as their overall success. It adds a unique perspective by focusing specifically on occupational therapy curriculum at Wits, where students must master highly technical academic English while also navigating multilingual as well as clinical settings. So while the previous studies have highlighted general challenges faced by non-first language English-speaking students, few have explored how these barriers play out in professional programs like OT that demand both academic as well as clinical communication skills. So by centering on students' lived experiences at Wits, this study bridges the gap between the broad discussions of language inequality in higher education and the discipline-specific realities of occupational therapy, offering insights for more inclusive teaching practices as well as multilingual support strategies.
Okay, now for the methodology. In terms of the study design, We chose a qualitative design because it helped us to explore the real experiences and challenges of non-first language English-speaking OT students at Wits. And in terms of the population, we recruited 12 first and second year OT students, which were enough for qualitative saturation according to Hannick and Kesa, which was part of our articles that we read. Another reason we chose first and second year students is because they are still in the transition phase from high school to university, and these years are mainly campus-based with lectures, tutorials, including courses like psychology, anatomy, physics, and chemistry. And then for our sample selection, we used non-probability purposes sampling method, which is appropriate for qualitative research as key participants' insights were approached. Students were recruited via WhatsApp groups through class reps with a Google form containing the participant information letter to screen eligibility and obtain consent. We also visited first and second year classes in person to introduce the study and invite volunteers. Inclusion criteria were first and second year registered OT students who are non-first language English speakers, while students were under 18 were excluded. And in terms of the data collection, we used semi-structured interviews to collect data. Interviews were scheduled according to participants' availability and format preference. 2 chose virtual, while 10 were interviewed in person on campus. We used an interview guide, which included 3 main questions derived from the research objectives, along with a set of prompts for each question. All interviews were audio recorded and transcribed. And in terms of the data analysis, we used content analysis to explore participants' perspectives. After transcription, each researcher analyzed transcripts of the participants they interviewed to identify meaning units and assign descriptive codes. We then all reviewed the transcripts, grouped codes into categories, and finally developed themes linking categories to reveal deeper insights. And in terms of the rigor, we ensured rigor by following the Lincolnian and Gover's framework, and these are the strategies we used. For credibility was achieved through clear and criteria permissions, and then reliability was achieved through careful documentation of procedures. We also maintained an audit trail for confirmability, and we gave detailed description for transferability and used member checking to validate our findings. For translanguaging, all 6 researchers were involved in data analysis, checked the interpretations, and ensured no researchers' bias influenced the results. And then in this slide, we are showing the themes as well as the sub-themes that guided our findings. So the first theme looks at engaging with the OT curriculum, and then the second theme looks at the innovative ways that students use to learn, as well as the third theme for recommendations for institutional support. For the findings for the first theme, it highlights how students' English language backgrounds shaped their ability and confidence to engage with language at Wits. It showed how students who grew up speaking English at home felt more confident in understanding lectures, assignments, and jargon in their home language, while others from non-English backgrounds struggled more with concepts, terminology, and expressing themselves in class or during PBLs, which are problem-based learning, and their accents influenced confidence and how approachable they felt to their peers. It also revealed that even students who are comfortable with English often found academic and medical terminology overwhelming. Many described translating between English and their home languages while studying, which increased their workload and sometimes affected exam performance. It also captured how fear of mispronouncing words made some students reluctant to ask questions or participate in discussions. But also group work was often seen as a safe space where peers supported one another and helped to bridge communication barriers. And for the second theme, which is using innovative ways to understand and learn, students in the study demonstrated a proactive approach to managing the demands of OT curriculum. They used AI tools such as ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, and Google to look up unfamiliar terms, simplify complex language, translate content into their home language, and clarify difficult concepts. AI was also used to improve grammar, writing, as well as understanding, and they reviewed lecture slides in advance, highlighted confusing terms, also made notes, and used AI or online connected lecture content to everyday to clarify concepts after class. Many connected lecture content to everyday examples or clinical experiences to deepen understanding, and students collaborated in study groups, translated content, or clarified concepts with classmates, sometimes using shared language backgrounds or more fluent peers to bridge understanding. PBL sessions also provided valuable opportunities for discussion and collective problem solving. Now for theme 3, which is recommendations for institutional support, students reported that jargon and complex terminology in OT modules created barriers to comprehension. They suggested having tutors, preferably senior OT students or postgraduate, for their extra classes or workshops for reliability. Some even proposed a first-year English module specifically tailored to OT to strengthen reading, writing, and professional communication skills. And students suggested peer learning and mixed language groups, translation apps, glossaries on lecture slides, bilingual administrative documents. They suggested simplifying the level of English in lectures to enhance inclusivity without reducing academic standards. And there was a strong preference for accessible written and recorded learning materials. This includes visual and auditory content and recordings of lectures for repeated review, helping them to reinforce the terminology, to understand the OT-specific jargon and study at their own pace. Now in terms of the discussion, our first theme looked at how students from diverse linguistic backgrounds engage with the OT curriculum at Wits. So many participants shared that at home and at school, the main language of communication was not English. And English was usually only used by teachers in class, while family and community life happened in home languages such as Sesotho, isiZulu, Afrikaans, or even Urdu. Because of this, many students faced difficulties when they entered the OT curriculum. They struggled with academic jargon, presenting confidently in class, and keeping up with group conversations during problem-based learning. This links to what Ramifikeng and others have found, that many South African students enter higher education with English as an additional language, and this creates challenges in comprehension as well as engagement. Non-English speaking students struggled more translating terms into their home language to make sense of the content. Participants spoke about how their accents, pronunciation, limited fluency made them less confident, sometimes anxious, and reluctant to speak up in class. This reflects the literature that explains that non-English speaking students are often unfairly seen as less competent, even when they have valuable insights. And this also connects to the Wits language policy, which recognizes South Africa's multilingual reality and calls for an inclusive environment. However, our findings show that in occupational therapy, English still dominates, leaving many students disadvantaged. What was particularly interesting is that almost 50% of our participants were Afrikaans first language speakers. Historically, Afrikaans benefited from the apartheid policies as one of the main languages of instruction, while indigenous African languages were marginalized. Because of this history, there has been an assumption that Afrikaans-speaking students would not face language-related challenges in higher education. Yet our findings complicate this assumption. Importantly, Afrikaans is not recognized within the Wits language policy as one of the priority languages for development. This shows that language barriers in higher education are not only an African language issue, but can also disadvantage Afrikaans speakers, further emphasizing how English dominance continues to marginalize multiple groups of students. And in terms of the second theme, we found that participants actively developed strategies to cope and succeed. Some turned to digital tools, as we mentioned, like ChatGPT, Google Translate, or online glossaries to simplify OT jargon. Others translated material into their home languages, developed personal study strategies, or collaborated with peers. This shows resourcefulness as well as adaptability. Students weren't waiting for the system to adjust. They were finding their own ways of making learning accessible. For example, some preferred study groups where peers could explain concepts in their home languages and others used AI to break down complex content. And this aligns with the research by Ramifique, who found that students often engage in behind-the-scenes translation and multilingual practices to manage academic tasks. However, our study also highlights a gap. While the Wits language policy promotes multilingualism, in practice, students are still carrying the responsibility themselves, often without formal institutional support. And now for theme 3, with recommendations, students highlighted that peers via study groups, problem-based learning, or informal help were key in overcoming language barriers. However, opinions varied. Some valued language-based peer groups, while others felt they caused a division, showing the need to balance inclusivity as well as integration. Participants also suggested glossaries on PowerPoint slides, simplified definitions of OT jargon, bilingual documents, and structured language support workshops. These recommendations connect strongly to the Wits language policy, which commits to translating documents and supporting multilingualism. However, as our findings suggest, many of these measures have not yet been fully implemented in occupational therapy. Importantly, participants stressed that simplifying English is not about lowering standards, but about making learning inclusive. This links to what Kulubama and Fadebe in 2022, who argued that accessible learning and multilingual strategies reduce barriers to knowledge. In conclusion, language barriers not only influence academic performance, but also shape professional identity, as communication is central to occupational therapy practice. Addressing these barriers is therefore essential to ensure that future graduates are confident, competent, and able to serve South Africa's linguistically diverse population. Inclusive teaching, simplified discipline-specific language, and supportive learning environments are needed to close the gap. And furthermore, acknowledging and integrating the innovative strategies that students already use into formal teaching may enhance accessibility as well as equity in OT education. Ultimately, our research highlights that fostering linguistic inclusivity within occupational therapy programs is not just a matter of academic support, but a professional imperative. And by addressing these language barriers, educators can better prepare students to deliver culturally and linguistically responsive care, strengthening the profession's ability to meet the needs of diverse communities. Thank you.
Dan, thank you so much for being part of this very important conversation and taking the time out of your very full schedules. And it's really quite delightful to see how you've already mastered methodology, for example, in research. And for me personally, I can't wait to see the space for you enrolling in your master's degrees and your PhDs. So, but let's give our audience an opportunity. I don't see any questions yet in the chat, and Nayo Klele, who's our chat moderator, will alert us if there are questions posted in our Padlet link as well. Yes, please go ahead.
Ladies, thank you so much. This is beautifully aligned with one of my current obsessions. I just wanted to check, because we were thinking of creating simulations in different languages. If I can just ask you to repeat, what were your students? It was predominantly Afrikaans, and then what were the languages? Yeah, if you could just repeat those, because I just want to know, like, when we do our thing, which languages do we can't obviously do 11 in one go, but which languages should we be prioritizing?
We had Venda, Afrikaans, Setswana, Pedi, Sesotho, and Hutu.
Yeah. What do you think I okay, so Afrikaans, Setswana, Venda, Sesotho,
And Pedi.
and Pedi. Thank you.
I've got a question about comprehension, right? So it's a big shift from a native language, learning English medium, and then going through the years. So learning that comprehension, so you have the time to translate notes, understand concepts. But once you're in exam venue, are students able to read questions in English and understand and comprehend what they're asking when they don't have access to peers to translate and discuss topics? Was that asked in the questions?
Yes, that was asked in the questions. I think one of our participants actually struggled with that. She mentioned that when they would do exams, she actually suggested that she would prefer that maybe tests were better simplified for them, because she actually failed chemistry because of language barriers as well. So that was
And then, so let's give, and then you.
Oh, thank you very much. I still want to talk about the idea of simplifying English. So I just want to find out, how do you simplify jargon terms? So like that big word in occupational therapy, which is in English, ideally, I think, how is then that simplified? So then we know how to simplify. But I think for me, that's the first question. But then my second question is, what is Wits not doing right? What is Wits doing wrong? Especially considering that Wits has 3 official languages, one of them being Sesotho and isiZulu. But then it seems like almost everything is in English. So in terms of teaching and learning, what is Wits doing right? What is Wits not doing right? What is Wits doing wrong?
Okay, so for the first question on like how do you simplify like terms, right? So for example, during a lecture, right, and then like there'll be a word like occupation, right? In occupational therapy, for example, like there'll be a word like occupation. So a simplified term for that would be like a daily activity, something that you do every day, right? And I think once you hear something that you do every day, it gives you like a better understanding of what an occupation actually is, as compared to when you hear the word occupation. So the first time when you hear the word occupation, you're thinking work, but actually in occupational therapy, and this is where simplifying terms would help. Like you get an idea that, okay, occupation is not like, doesn't mean work, but rather it means like something like a daily activity, something that you do every day. So that would be like simplifying terms. And then the second question on like, what is Wits not getting right? So in occupational therapy, the Wits language policy hasn't yet been implemented. So I wouldn't say that there's something that they're not doing right. There's something that they're doing wrong, because it hasn't been implemented at all. So I guess then if they had to implement it, then maybe we would find like what are they really not doing right, or like be able to critique it essentially, you know. But it hasn't been implemented yet in occupational therapy. Teaching is still in English fully.
I'm sorry. Okay, can we just keep next?
Thank you. Thank you so much for clearly articulating your research study, but also doing it in such a way that is fully involved. I think as an audience fully understood what you were talking about. Mine is, I think, more of a comment coming from a background where English is also my nth language. I understand fully what you mean. And what I would just look at is, you know, something around what is our language of thought when we are learning? Because the assumption is, because English is the language of teaching, then it's supposed to be automatically the language of my learning. It's the language of the lecturer's teaching, but it may not necessarily be the language in which I process things. And I think this speaks to issues of social responsiveness. You might not have been here earlier in the morning, but these are issues that were raised much of today. and we are not socially responsive as staff. We are not socially responsive as an institution. I was probably even thinking of one of the pillars, I think, of the Wits 2033 strategy, which has to do with public engagement and so on. We have a public within ourselves as an institution that we are not responding to. How are we going to be able to respond to a public that's outside there, unless if we will be doing it to be on the news or doing it for our own promotion or something like that? I'm speaking to us as academics here, that we are not engaging the public that we were given to work with. And so that is how we get to a point such as this, where we assume that the language that I'm using to teach is the same language that the student is processing it. And as a teacher, I also see it in maybe you can also even see it in the way in which I am expressing myself, because I have to think more than many of you do to say which is the right word that I need to use. So I take longer to respond. I take longer to process the question, translate into the languages that I am comfortable with, and that requires time. But I cannot go and ask for extra time on that basis. I can't apply for extra time on that basis for exams. The assumption is that the same time that everyone was given to read, given to process. Sorry, I can go on and on, but thank you.
You want to respond to that?
It's just, I think it's one of the questions that we also had, like, how can lecturers also accommodate students? And the recommendation that was raised was that maybe lecturers should also have like a language program as well. And maybe like in that program, there should be ways in which they can accommodate students. How can we force communication? How can we address the language barriers as well? Because it is an issue. So.
Sorry, just to add as well, I'm now thinking of like how like African students usually at school, like in high school, right? Like when you go to like a school where like an indigenous language is like the first language, like you get to that class and they're doing life sciences. It's in English, but like there's a lot of like isiZulu going on in the class. There's a lot of like isiZulu and they're interacting in isiZulu, but it's life sciences. And just to also answer your question, like once you understand something in like your native language, I guess, right? When you get to a test or an exam, like you being asked like whatever question, right? But once you understand it like from the core, I guess, with your own language, it's much easier for you to like actually, you know, like answer the question on the exam, even though you're not gonna answer the exam question with like the best English, right? But you'll be able to like articulate yourself and you'll be able to like, you know, and usually like they do very well, because it's a thing of like, okay, I'm learning life sciences in isiZulu, it's in English, yes, but like, okay, the teacher is very like interactive. Okay, this is how reproduction happens, but they're explaining it more in isiZulu, in a language that they also fluent in, a language that they also understand, and it's like it's very, yeah.
Can we, Dom, please go ahead?
Yeah, I'm just thinking after sort of bouncing off your presentation that in a way, good enough AI solves some of the problem. If I could perfectly translate something from English to Venda. But on the other hand, the cultural stuff that Constance is pointing out, and as you're saying, the teacher understands that language. So even AI and translation doesn't quite get to where we want to go here, which makes it like a really difficult problem to solve with so many different languages. And it seems one obvious way of getting around it is the lecturer knows those languages. But how many languages is it practical for?
So it's a problem because the
the lecturers who are native speakers of that language were taught the content in English.
Right.
So it's not a short fix, it's a long fix, because learning the content in any local language is already hard, right? Learning in your own language is already hard because it's a very technical concept, right? OT's got very technical terms. Now you have to learn it in multiple languages. And when you learn the English, now you have to learn it in your own native language to teach it. It's not that easy. You can't just translate it. It's not a quick fix.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's
complex.
Translation. It's going on.
Thank you. Sorry.
A couple of thoughts perhaps, and maybe a suggestion, and maybe a little muddying of the waters. So the thing that you said, we often hear the argument about tongue language, mother tongue languages, and it's exactly for that reason that people say that. So when you first introduced to a notion in your own language, and later on you have to learn about that same thing in a different language, the base vocabulary is already settled, so it is really much easier to learn in a different language when you already settled the home language thing about it. In terms of understandability of academic text, people like B. Miller and Laufer, I think B. Miller talks about 90% of any text, that if you know 90% of the words in a text, you can make meaning of the rest through Gestalt, through your mind closing in gaps type of thing. So in a sentence, there's one word that you don't know, and because you know the other words in the sentence, you can figure out what they mean by the sentence. So that it sounds like a hard percentage, but you must try that exercise, just scratch out some words and see if you can still make meaning of it. 90%, and Laufer says 95%. You need to understand to really understand what you're reading. And so the suggestion that you get from international language, I'm going to muddy the water, is that if you teach the 2,000 words most often used in the English language, and you add to that the academic word list, which is a list of 570 words that are used very frequently in academic text, and you teach jargon of the specific discipline, you get to that 95% coverage of a text. And so in theory, that's what you need to do in the classroom, is to make sure that your students have an understanding of the first 2,000 words plus the academic word list plus jargon. The muddying of the waters is the study is done internationally. So internationally, there's a specific order in which the language, English as a language, is learned. So it's like a list of the first 1,000 most frequently used words and the second most frequently used words. But the one experiment I did in South Africa is that what I saw, and the evidence isn't that strong, but it's that South African words in a different order. We don't language in the same order as and so you'd have to do some research to see which of those 1,000, 2,000 South Africans. The difficulty about jargon and the difficulty of implementing language text in the sense of having to translate text into the official language of the university is quite often the jargon specifically doesn't have a local language equivalent. So how do you translate, I don't know what medical term into your own language if people don't have an understanding? And so there's been attempts across the country to codify language as academic languages. And again, a difficulty is that different people have got different translations, and so there's no one single set of and so much of the research that you read is done in Europe with second language speakers, meaning their first language is Spanish or French or so on, which are already well-developed academic languages. And so, people say, okay, so now what you do is you do a little, my research topic, a little pop-up with an explanation of the term your own language. And so, you know, there you go. But you can't do that in South Africa. The home language doesn't have that translation that you can do. So students actually prefer the English, South African students prefer the English explanation of a term rather than isiZulu or isiXhosa translation, because they don't understand the language that comes up in the explanation.
Comments on that comment, actually where we started when I picked up the group in April last year, is that the students initially wanted to look at OT terms and find isiZulu equivalents for them. And I looked at this because I adopted the group when I started from the person whose post I filled. And I looked at this, I'm like, this is like going to be an impossible study. Like, how do we, because I mean, I worked in rural Eastern Cape as my first job, and there isn't a isiXhosa word for occupational therapist. I was which means the doctor of persons with disabilities, which is a terrible description for our training. You know what I mean? So like, even, you know, what an occupational therapist is in vernac is, you know, it's not defined. So, you know, so that's where we started, and we kind of shifted. It's because the whole group is non-first language English speakers, and I think that's why I've been so proud of them, because they've really embodied the topic. So yeah, just maybe a little insight to the background of where we started as the group.
I respond as well as, even if they were a term, that doesn't necessarily mean that the term is familiar to your students. So I've heard this comment often, and because I don't speak any other languages, I can't speak for the truth with it, but I've heard it often enough that, and specifically in the context of isiZulu, is where people who stay in Joburg who speak Zulu goes back to KZN, they don't understand. And that's kind of like deep Zulu. But so the terms exist in KwaZulu-Natal, but people in Joburg don't understand that term. So there might be a term, but it might still not be a familiar term. So it's a difficult thing to, until the languages are codified as academic languages with settled terms for things. It's kind of really difficult to translate effectively, I guess, into the languages.
I'm sorry, as a chair, I understand there is an agenda for pushing the time up a little bit. So in order for you not to miss out on the next session, I'm so sorry to having to conclude this session, but it's obvious to everybody that you've opened up a gate for a lot more dialogue, and congratulations again on a very important study. And I hope once you're through your exit level exams that you get the energy next year to write this up and get it published. It needs to be heard. So and all best with the last stretch of your final year. And thank you once again for bringing and sharing your insights with us. Thank you.